Power, Elena would come to learn, did not arrive like a storm. It crept in quietly. At first, it looked like stability, consistent income, predictable routines, the ability to plan beyond tomorrow. Then it became leverage, the subtle understanding that every transaction, every favor, every agreement carried weight beyond what was visible. And eventually, it became choice, the kind she had never been allowed to have before. By the time Mira turned 3, Elena's life no longer resembled the fragile existence she had once clung to. The room with the leaking ceiling had been replaced by a modest apartment, small but clean, with sunlight that reached the floors in the morning and stayed just long enough to feel like a promise. There was food on the table, not always abundant, but steady. Reliable, and reliability, Elena had learned, was its own form of wealth. But she wasn't satisfied, because survival had taught her endurance. But it had also awakened something sharper. Awareness. She began to see patterns where others saw routine. The way suppliers manipulated prices depending on urgency. The way middlemen inflated value simply by controlling access. The way information, simple, overlooked information, could shift outcomes entirely. And most importantly, she saw how easily people underestimated her. A woman with no formal education, a former maid, a young mother. To most, she was still invisible. But now, she understood the advantage of that. Matteo watched the change with quiet approval. He didn't interfere, didn't guide her every step. Instead, he did something far more valuable. He let her make decisions. Even the wrong ones. Especially the wrong ones. Because each mistake refined her instincts in ways no instruction ever could. "You're thinking too small," he told her one evening, as they reviewed numbers at a worn wooden table. Elena didn't look up. "I'm thinking safely." Matteo shook his head. "Safety is just controlled fear." That made her pause. "And fear keeps you where you are," he added. Elena leaned back slightly, her gaze sharpening. "And risk destroys people." "Uncalculated risk," Matteo corrected. Then, after a brief silence, "You're ready." "For what?" she asked. "For something bigger." The opportunity came in the form of logistics. At first glance, it didn't seem like much. Transportation, warehousing, distribution, simple, functional systems that most people overlooked because they lacked glamour. But Elena didn't care about appearances anymore. She cared about structure, and logistics was structure at its core. If you control movement, Matteo explained, you control timing. And if you control timing, Elena added slowly, you control outcomes. Matteo smiled faintly. "Now you're thinking." They started small, a single contract, then 2, then more. Elena negotiated directly, her voice steady, her words precise. She didn't try to impress. She didn't pretend to know everything. Instead, she listened, carefully, and used what she learned. People began to notice, not loudly, not all at once, but gradually. There was something different about her. She didn't chase deals. She positioned herself so deals came to her. And when they did, she chose carefully, because now she understood something she hadn't before. Not every opportunity was worth taking. Growth followed, not explosive, but consistent, and consistency built credibility. Credibility built trust, and trust opened doors. It was through one of those doors that she met Victor Tan. The setting was deliberate, a formal business gathering, quietly exclusive, filled with people who spoke in measured tones and made decisions that moved more money than most would see in a lifetime. Elena almost didn't attend. "This isn't my world," she told Matteo. "Not yet," he replied. Then, after a pause, "But it could be." She arrived without spectacle, no grand entrance, no attempt to stand out. But presence isn't always about visibility. Sometimes, it's about composure. Victor noticed her not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. While others spoke to be heard, Elena observed. While others pushed, she waited. And when she finally spoke, it was with clarity, not excess, not performance, just precision. Their first conversation was brief, transactional, but meaningful. "You're new," Victor said. Elena met his gaze evenly. "So are most opportunities." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. Fair point. What followed wasn't immediate connection. There were no sudden alliances. No dramatic shifts. Just consistency. They crossed paths again, and again. Each time, the conversations grew slightly longer. Slightly deeper. Victor wasn't easily impressed. He didn't value charm or ambition alone. He valued discipline, and Elena had that in abundance. One evening, after a particularly tense negotiation between multiple parties, Victor approached her directly. "You don't react," he said. Elena tilted her head slightly. "I do, not visibly." She considered that. "Reaction is expensive," she replied. "I prefer to spend carefully." Victor's expression shifted, subtle but noticeable. Recognition, trust, when it came, wasn't given. It was built, through actions, through decisions, through consistency over time. Victor began involving Elena in larger deals, not as a favor, but as a strategic choice. And Elena delivered. Not perfectly, but effectively. Their partnership grew, professionally at first, then gradually, personally, but not in the way Elena had experienced before. There were no rushed emotions. No blurred boundaries, no illusions. Victor didn't offer promises. He offered presence. And for Elena, that was enough. When he proposed marriage, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was quiet, deliberate. Not because you need this, he said, but because we work. Elena didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't about survival, or escape, or even ambition. This was about choice. And for the first time in her life, she took her time making it. She said yes. The marriage changed everything, not just in status, but in access. Doors that once required negotiation now opened with recognition. Faces that once excluded her now made room. And yet, Elena didn't forget. She didn't soften. She didn't become complacent. Because power, she knew, could be lost just as quietly as it was gained. But beneath the surface of everything she had built, something remained unfinished. Not a wound. Not exactly. Something else. Something patient. Something waiting. The Villarreal family. Elena had not spoken their name in years. But she had never truly let it go. Because some experiences don't fade. They settle. They embed themselves into who you become. And while Elena had moved forward, she had not moved on. One evening, as she reviewed financial reports in her office, now expansive, refined, a reflection of everything she had achieved, she came across a familiar name. Villarreal Holdings. At first, it was just data. Numbers. Declining assets. Unstable patterns. But then, she looked closer, and what she saw was weakness. Matteo, she said quietly, calling him in. He stepped into the room, his presence as steady as ever. You see this? She asked, sliding the report toward him. He scanned it briefly, then looked up. They're bleeding. Elena's gaze didn't waver. From what? Matteo hesitated. Then, gambling. The word hung in the air. Heavy, loaded, familiar. Elena leaned back slowly, and for the first time in years, she smiled. Not with warmth, not with joy, but with understanding. Because now, everything made sense. They didn't just cast me out, she said softly. They assumed I would stay down. Matteo nodded. That's usually how it works. Elena's eyes sharpened. Not this time. Because now, the power had shifted. The girl who once walked silently through their halls was no longer invisible. The woman they discarded now stood in a position they could not ignore. And the family that once controlled everything was beginning to lose it. Elena didn't rush. She didn't confront. She didn't announce. Because real power didn't need to be loud. It only needed to be precise. And this time, she wasn't just going to survive. She was going to take everything. Revenge, Elena discovered, was not an act. It was a process. Messy revenge was emotional, loud, temporary, but the kind she wanted was precise, permanent, invisible until it was too late. She didn't begin with confrontation. She began with information. Every move, every decision, every vulnerability of the Villarreal family had to be understood, not guessed, not assumed, but mapped with the same discipline she had used to build her life. Because this wasn't about anger anymore. This was about control. They're overleveraged, Matteo said, laying out documents across the table in Elena's office. The room was quiet, insulated from the outside world, built for decisions that required focus. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected the city lights, but Elena wasn't looking out. She was looking down, at numbers, patterns, weakness. Not just overleveraged, he continued. They're desperate. Elena traced a line across one of the reports with her finger, her expression unreadable. Desperation makes people predictable. Matteo nodded. And predictable people are easy to corner. The source of the collapse was exactly what they had suspected. Dona Isabella's gambling had gone far beyond indulgence. It had become dependency. Private tables, high stakes, quiet losses hidden beneath layers of reputation and denial. But money, no matter how well disguised, always leaves a trail. And Elena had learned how to follow it. They've started liquidating assets, Matteo said. Elena's lips curved slightly. Good. Quietly, he added. They're trying to avoid attention. They won't succeed. Because Elena wasn't going to expose them. She was going to absorb them. The first acquisition was small. So small it barely registered. A minor logistics contract tied to one of the Villarreal subsidiaries. Underperforming. Overlooked. Elena purchased it through a third-party shell company. No name. No connection. No trace. And when the paperwork cleared, nothing happened. No reaction. No suspicion. Exactly as she intended. Why start so small? Matteo asked. Elena didn't look up from the documents she was reviewing. Because people don't notice erosion. She turned a page calmly. They notice collapse. The second acquisition came weeks later. Then a third. Each one carefully chosen. Not random. Not impulsive. Strategic. She wasn't just taking assets. She was dismantling structure. Removing support in places the Villarreals didn't even realize were critical. Meanwhile, from the outside, Everything looked stable. The Villarreal name still carried weight. Their presence still commanded respect. But internally, cracks were forming, and Elena was widening them. Victor watched her work without interference. He didn't question her motives, didn't challenge her decisions, but he observed, carefully, because while he understood strategy, he also understood cost. This won't end cleanly, he said one evening. Elena met his gaze. It was never clean to begin with. Victor nodded slowly. That's not what I meant. There was a brief silence. Then, just make sure you know when to stop. Elena didn't answer, because she wasn't sure yet. The turning point came when Dona Isabella made a mistake. Not a public one, not a dramatic one, but a critical one. She borrowed large sums from the wrong people. Private lenders, Matteo said, his tone more serious now. Elena leaned forward slightly. Terms, unforgiving, a pause, and enforceable. Elena understood immediately. This wasn't just financial pressure anymore. This was risk, real risk, the kind that didn't negotiate. Then it's time, Elena said quietly. Up until that point, everything had been preparation, positioning, but now, it was execution. She moved faster, more directly. The shell companies began consolidating assets instead of just acquiring them. Control shifted from scattered ownership to centralized authority. And slowly, the truth began to surface. At first, the Villarreals didn't believe it. They couldn't, because the idea that someone had been dismantling their empire from within, without them noticing, was unthinkable, until it wasn't. Meetings became tense. Voices were raised behind closed doors. Lawyers were called. Documents were reviewed again and again, searching for errors that didn't exist. Who is behind this? One of the board members demanded. But no one had an answer, because Elena had made sure there wouldn't be one, until she was ready. The day everything collapsed didn't come with warning. There was no announcement, no public spectacle, just reality. Accounts frozen, assets seized, contracts terminated, ownership transferred, and suddenly, the Villarreal empire was no longer theirs. Dona Isabella stood in what had once been her office, the weight of years of control pressing against her for the first time. This is impossible, she said. But even she knew, it wasn't, because the truth had finally arrived. Not as a shock, but as a conclusion. Elena, the name felt unfamiliar on her tongue. Not because she had forgotten it, but because she had never expected to say it like this. The meeting was arranged quickly, urgently, because desperation doesn't wait. Elena didn't rush. She chose her time, her setting, her entrance. The Villarreal mansion, the same place where everything had begun, the same place where she had once stood, powerless. Now, she walked through the front doors without hesitation, not as staff, not as someone seeking permission, but as the owner. The air felt different, or maybe, she did. Dona Isabella was already there, waiting, but no longer untouchable. They stood facing each other in silence. Years of distance, years of transformation, all reduced to a single moment. You, Isabella said finally, her voice steady, but thinner than Elena remembered. Elena inclined her head slightly. Dona Isabella, not out of respect, but acknowledgement. You've destroyed us. The accusation hung between them, heavy, but incomplete. Elena took a step forward, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor. No, her voice was calm, controlled, certain. You destroyed yourselves. She paused, then added, I just made sure there was nothing left to save. For the first time, Dona Isabella had no response. Because this wasn't a confrontation. It was an ending, but as Elena turned to leave, she felt it. Not doubt, not regret, but something else. A question, because revenge, she realized, didn't feel the way she expected it to. There was no satisfaction, no release, no sense of completion, just silence, and the unsettling awareness that everything she had built this for was now behind her. Follow for part 3.